particularly, it's even more important than the last time I spoke. And with that, I thank you. I'm looking forward to hearing two of my favorite people. I like them so much, they're both going to come teach in the version of the class that we're doing at Harvard. So I hope I didn't offend either one of them too much.
Good evening. So, I could go slide by slide. I could actually just put David's up and redo it, but you would come to a very different conclusion. But I'm not actually going to do that, although it would be entertaining, maybe after the break. I'll just open with one observation, which is that if David had tried to do the same analysis for highway projects, he couldn't actually do it. And there's two reasons he couldn't do it. One is we don't make highway projects go through any kind of analysis as to why we're building them or how cost effective we are, like we do with transit projects. There is actually no federal process for deciding how to spend highway dollars other than the desire to spend them. But more importantly, the reason you couldn't do it is that David could at least begin by coming up with the unit of measurement that represented the public good that we were deriving from the investment, namely new transit riders per day, and then measure how much that costs. If you were to ask 50 transportation planners, what is the actual unit of good achieved by building new highways, I'm not even sure they would agree on. What are new cars? No, that adds to congestion. Can't be more cars on the road. Less cars on the road? Can't get less cars on the road by building roads. We know that. So we don't even know why we're building roads. So therefore, you couldn't ever analyze the cost effectiveness of building roads because you have to know what the effectiveness part of the equation is. So keeping that in mind, I'm actually going to start in a very different place from David and kind of circle back. He's asking a question that's very important in transportation, right? Which is the sort of which ones do you build question. Transportation planners love the which ones do you build question. I spent 20 years as an advocate actually fighting about the which ones you build. Now that I've sort of sauntered over here to Northeastern and spent 4 or 5 years in academia, I'm much more interested in a much more fundamental question, which is why? Why do we actually care about urban transportation? So I'm going to start with why. At the very end, I'm going to try to circle back to what is the why, what does the answer to why tell you about which ones, okay? So, why does transportation matter for cities? Because after all, this is of course about cities. You should think of the transportation system as being exactly like the circulatory system. My husband is a doctor, who's kind enough to give me this. So, if blood doesn't move around our bodies, we die. If goods and people don't move around in metropolitan areas, there's no economy. We got to move people around, we got to move goods around. That's what the transportation system does. There's a symbiotic relationship between cities and transportation, okay? The way we build our transportation system shapes the way our cities are. The way our cities are shapes the way we build our transportation system. My primary argument to you tonight, since this is a class about cities, is that cities, cars don't work for cities. They just don't. Automobiles don't work for cities. Transit infrastructure better leverages urban land values. Urban land is a precious commodity. Wasting it on car-related infrastructure is just economically inefficient. Transit is what lets the city, the density that cities need, support. You couldn't move the number of people into Boston in cars that we move in on the T every day. It would not be physically possible. The whole city would just be roadways and parking spaces. So it may not be enough, and it may not be a big enough share, but the truth is we couldn't get them into town to the jobs that we have here and to the other destinations. And finally, cities work well because lots of things are close to each other in cities, and when you have very short trips, right, cars are the stupidest way to get around. I mean, just getting to your car, unparking it, moving it, and reparking it, right, takes longer than just walking down the block to grab a sandwich for lunch. So in a city, right, no one drives to get a sandwich for lunch, but in the suburbs, everybody does. Okay, cars take up too much room. This is along the medical area, okay? This is a chart of how many jobs, the line on top is how many new jobs the Longwood Medical Area is planning to add. The bottom is the chart of how many new parking spaces the Polick medical area is planning to add. If they can't keep transit ridership at 50% or higher, right, no one's going to get to any of those jobs, let alone their medical appointments there. The reason that they are doing this is not, although many of the folks doing this planning are friends of mine, but it's not actually because they are ideologically opposed to the automobile as a method of transportation for the 21st century. It is because it takes too much room to provide parking from all those cars, and the land is worth much more as a clinic, hospital, or biotech lab, and they're just not interested in devoting the land to parking anymore. Okay, so that's my first page. I want to talk a little bit more on the why question. I want to make 3 points. Why we can't keep going the way we've been going when we think about urban transportation. One is, it's too expensive. One is, we now care about climate change and we didn't used to. And the last one is an awful lot of people get left out if we build an entire transportation system around the car. The most expensive thing you spend money on is housing. Barry's going to talk about that next week, and Paul and their speakers. The second most important thing you spend money on is actually transportation. Most of us don't know that because for housing we write one check a month in the form of a mortgage or a rent check. And transportation dribbles out. You pay your car insurance, you buy gas, you get an oil change, someone dings you, you get it fixed. But it actually costs a lot of money. And what's interesting is you can make life more affordable if you live with transit, because people who live where there's transit spend less than 10% of their monthly income on transportation, and people who live where there's not transit spend nearly a quarter of their income on transportation. So transportation is expensive at the individual and the household level, and that's why I've made the argument for years that this very important issue that you're going to talk about more next week of housing affordability, you can't even talk about without talking about transportation. Because the #1 strategy that we've had in the last half century for making housing more affordable, right, has been to make transportation more expensive. It's called drive to qualify, right? The cheap stuff is way far out. You cut your monthly housing costs, but you spend more on the car. When you look across metropolitan areas, it is actually striking how little variation there is between combined housing and transportation costs. It's just in some places housing is more and transportation is less, and in others transportation is more and housing is less. But it's very hard to avoid spending between 50 and 60% of your income on housing and transportation combined. Phoenix and Boston are equally affordable if you add housing and transportation together. That's before the crash. So we spend a lot on the household level at transportation. At the national level, at one sense, we spend too much money, and David and I can debate whether we spend it well. But the truth is we actually don't spend anywhere near enough money. We're letting the entire transportation system fall apart. We're living on investment that we made in the 50s and 60s. Right? So from 1950 to 1980, we increased our investment in transportation, and we saw an increase in GDP. I'm not going to talk about which way the causality runs. From 1980 to 2007, we substantially cut our public investment in infrastructure. Just so you understand, the U.S. is spending less than 1% of GDP on infrastructure. Europe spends 4%. China spends 7%. India spends 9%. If you want to talk about global economic competitiveness, it's interesting that the rest of the world has figured out that more infrastructure spending produces better economic gains, and we're fighting about, we're really fighting over crumbs. You know, which project we build doesn't matter. We should have enough money to build all of them. And again, David focused on transit. This is cumulative federal investment in our transportation system starting in 1956. I had to make it this big because you'd miss the transit part at the bottom, okay? So what David is talking about is what we do in that little tiny piece at the bottom. All that yellow stuff, we don't have any process for deciding whether we're investing our money well or not. In the meantime, you might think that this is a map of every transit system in the United States, and you'd be close. It's actually a map of every transit system that has proposed either major service cuts or major fare increases in the last 12 months. And it looks just like a map of every transit system in the United States because pretty much every transit system in the United States has opposed either service cuts, fare increases, or both. So we're not spending nearly enough money. Most of it is going into highways, and our transit system is starving to death. That's the first problem, the money problem. The second problem is the environmental problem. The big chart on the right was produced, not by me, although it would be cool, but by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. In order to answer the question, what would we need to do to reduce the emissions of the gases that cause climate change in the state of Massachusetts, as we are required to do by a new law called the Global Warming Solutions Act? So they asked a pretty reasonable question, which is if we want to get emissions down by 2020, what would happen if we didn't do anything between now and 2020? The blue line at the top is transportation greenhouse gas emissions. It goes straight up. You could shut down the electric grid in New England and not meet global climate change goals if you do not solve the transportation problem. Okay? Now you say, it's okay, we'll all drive really fuel-efficient cars. That will solve the problem. It doesn't work because emissions, which is the blue line, are really driven by how much we drive. If tomorrow all of us started driving cars that meet the new fuel efficiency standards that have been adopted, the blue line gets better. It's kind of flat. The problem is that our policy goal is to reduce emissions down to that 60% line by 2025. So we don't get there just by driving more fuel-efficient cars. So that's the second problem. Problem number one is the system's broke, and problem number two is it's driving climate change. Transportation emissions are the largest single source of climate change, and they are the fastest growing. The third problem that I want to touch on is the fact that the transportation system that we've built around the automobile simply doesn't actually serve the transportation needs of an increasingly large number of people. Okay? This is my short list of what I now have taken to calling the transportation disadvantaged in this country. And I'll talk a little bit about why. But people who don't have a lot of money, people who don't own cars, anybody under the age of 16 or 17, depending on what state you're in. Seniors, we'll talk about in a second. Disabled people, people whose language skills make it difficult for them to navigate our transportation system, and people who just live in places with lousy transportation. That turns out to be a very long list of Americans. Let's start with the fact that 1/3 of all, this is for Massachusetts, 1/3 of all the people in Massachusetts have no driver's license. So cars are not really useful to them except for if they can bum a ride. Okay? Second, we all know that the fastest growing demographic is seniors, aging baby boomers, whatever you want to call them. Well, it turns out that even in the second half of the 20th century, as we all drove more and more and more, seniors didn't drive more and more. In fact, as people age, historically, they've driven less. If we have a lot of seniors, and their desire is to throttle back on driving, which is what the travel data says to us, and we don't give them non-driving options, then one of two things is going to happen. They're not going to have access to things they need, like doctor's appointments or visiting their grandchildren, or working, for those whose 401ks aren't going to support an early retirement, or they are going to drive more. I showed you the chart of how much more we drive each year. That chart assumes that seniors are driving half as much as other demographic groups. If we suddenly have more seniors and they drive like other demographic groups, that line is going to go up even faster. So not everybody drives. Not everybody owns a car. You say, oh yeah, everybody owns a car. It's not true. And people in cities don't own cars. But seniors, again, are another demographic that will be tracked, even in a state like Massachusetts. Right? 1 in 5 households headed by a senior statewide, not in Boston, not in Metro Boston, statewide does not have a car in that household. 1 in 9 households in the entire state does not have a car. Now, some of that is non-car ownership by choice, but a lot of that is actually non-car ownership by economic necessity. And so a transportation system that works for people who own cars doesn't work for people who don't own cars. Now let's talk about the who of the folks who represent those $100 per day subsidies on transit. The people who use our transit system are disproportionately low income, and they are disproportionately minority. And David makes a good point about the distinction between transit and bus riders. Bus riders in particular come from very low income households. Half of all subway, this is US numbers, half of all subway riders, 2/3 of all bus riders in the US are from households that earn less than $50,000 annually. So, you know, it's really expensive. If we don't provide alternatives for people, they're just going to have to spend more of their income on transportation, or they're not going to be able to get to jobs or health care or other things that they need on a day-to-day basis. So we have a system that costs too much money at both the individual level, but also at the transit system and the US level. I should note, for example, on the cost too much money point of view, people probably don't even know how we pay for transportation at the federal level. We all pay a gas tax, it gets collected, and it gets sent back out to the states. And every 5 or 6 years, Congress says how much every state gets. And Congress never appropriates any of your other tax dollars for transportation. And for 5 decades, the system worked. And twice in the last 12 months, that fund that the gas taxes go into ran out of money. And the law under which we allocate that money to states expired on September 30th. And Congress wanted to extend it for 3 months so that the spending would go on and we'd keep building roads and stuff. And they literally could not find enough money to extend it for 90 days, so they extended it for 30 days in a desperate attempt to figure out where the money would come from to extend it for 90 days. So when I say the system is broke, I don't mean just the transit system is broke. The system is broke. So what are we going to do? That's where I want to end and then turn things over to Fred. How are we going to meet these challenges that I've been talking about? The first thing I would say is you can't think about transportation separate from all these other issues. You can't think about transportation separately from where housing goes and where jobs are and where poor people are and demographics and all of these other issues. The idea of transportation planners sitting in transportation agencies planning transportation projects actually may make no sense at all, no matter what the projects are or how much they cost. The second thing is, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, is we need to understand the why. What is the purpose of this investment? Then we can ask whether we're making smart investments. And finally, we have to think over a much longer period of time. If you had looked at the cost effectiveness of creating the interstate highway system and you had this, put it all on paper in 1950, it probably was a really stupid investment. The value of it was seen in retrospect. So we have the time horizon wrong when we think about transportation. Okay, so what's the new paradigm? The transportation system sees the big evil of our time as being stuck in a traffic jam. And really, honestly, most of the system is designed to minimize the extent to which we are stuck in traffic jams. What's scary about that statement is how much time do you spend stuck in traffic jams, right? So if the whole system has been focused for decades on minimizing that, and this is what we have, I would argue that's not all that successful, even if that's your objective. But I don't think it's the right objective. This should come as a shock to you at this point in the talk, right? David mentioned the concept of mobility. Mobility is the ability to get from point A to point B. It is what transportation planners think about. I don't think any of us actually care or want mobility. I think we want accessibility. We do not want school buses, right? We want our kids to get to school. We do not want parking lots. We want to be able to buy fresh produce close to our home. We do not want roads to get us to the medical care. We want the medical care. We do not want traffic jams, but we do want jobs. Accessibility is about the use of the transportation system to make sure that people can get to housing opportunity, employment opportunity, health care, recreation, anything they want in life. We don't think about the end of the transportation planning system as being access. We think about it as mobility. Mobility is a means, it's not an end. Moving from one place to another, it's one way of having access. It's not the only way of having access, and I can talk more during the break if you want, but this is what I've been working on. So here's my final thought. We're too impatient. This stuff takes a very long time. The number of things we can do in the next 5 years to really change our transportation system, although I actually sort of created a long list for this chart that I was asked to produce for the global warming working group I was working on. There's stuff we can do, but it's not a lot. When you think out to 10 years, and 15 years, and 20 years, the list, there's more we can do. So we need to do more in the short run, but we need to focus on how do we create accessible metropolitan areas, what a much longer time horizon, and then we'll have a lot more options. And then I think some of the investments in transit are actually going to make a lot more sense. Thank you.